Hello again, YouTube. I want to talk about a book by Lawrence Wright called Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief, as well as the documentary based on that book, which aired on HBO, also called Going Clear. Now, of course, I had some familiarity with Scientology because of the South Park episode, but... Hold on a second. Hello? Yeah, funny you should mention that because I'm actually filming a video about it now. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good point. They really are litigious. Alright, thanks. Bye. That was my lawyer reminding me that I should say that the content of this book is highly disputed by the Church of Scientology, and that they consider the allegations against the church in the person of L. Ron Hubbard to be entirely baseless fabrications. I just have to put that disclaimer out there before I get sued, basically. At any rate, this book. Now, of course, I was somewhat familiar with Scientology. Probably most people out there watching this video are already familiar with Scientology. And if you're a Scientology member, well, you're probably not watching this video because you're not supposed to be watching anything critical of the church, as if that doesn't raise any red flags. But this book, being a book, non-fiction book, quite lengthy, and it's too long, did not read documentary based on it, go into quite a bit of detail, and I found myself really fascinated in certain aspects of it. So I don't want to talk about the things about Scientology that everybody already knows. I don't want to be like the 100 millionth person to point out this, their whole creation myth of Galactic Lord Xenu and all of that. What did I find so interesting about the book and the documentary? I think you can break both of them down into several sections. Into a biography of Hubbard, into talking about David Miscavige, who is sort of like Stalin to Hubbard's Lenin, although they were both a bit like Stalin, and overall history of the church, as well as talking about the relationship between prominent, famous Scientology celebrities and the Church of Scientology, as well as talking about the experience of specific members who have defected from the church. So there's several different layers to the book/documentary. And one thing that I found fascinating is just Hubbard himself. Now, of course, even if he hadn't been a pathological liar who invented a fake religion, L. Ron Hubbard led an interesting life, even without all of the embellishments, which I'll come back to in just a second. And he is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most books in print. I heard in a different documentary about science fiction, I think it was on the history of pulp writing and science fiction, that someone claimed that L. Ron Hubbard used to write 1 million words a year. He's sort of a strange and fascinating character in and of himself. The thing about L. Ron Hubbard was that he was a pathological liar, prone to embellish virtually every aspect of his life. He was basically the ultimate resume patter. So, for example, during World War II, he became the captain of a ship based on a glowing letter of recommendation, which was allegedly from a prominent politician, but more likely was written by Hubbard himself, claiming that Hubbard had all of this experience which he in fact did not have. Later in the war, when he wanted to join a government program for diplomats who would be involved in the occupation of Japan, suddenly yet another letter where he claimed to know all sorts of foreign languages and have all kinds of experience that he didn't really have, got him into that. And throughout his career in promoting Scientology, he claimed that he had all of this scientific background that, guess what, he didn't actually have. He was constantly making things up, not only are the things that went into Scientology, the legendary story of Galactic Lord Xenu and his Guinness Book of World Records holding for the most books in publication, but he made things up about himself and used it to his advantage frequently. Now, one of the stories that I found most interesting involves the SeaOrg. So, after Scientology had become established, and I should say, for a little bit of context, Scientology, or at first it was just Dianetics and the Dianetic seminars, came about in the 1950s and started to grow in the 60s. And in that time in America, new religions were basically a dime a dozen, and these sorts of movements were very common. It was when you have the whole New Age movement and every other person in California is a guru. With Scientology, at first it was a bestseller and he got all these seminars and speaking fees. Then he decided it started to fade out. So he decided to essentially rebrand it as Scientology and make it into a religion. But in the process, he faced pushback. Now, because of battles with governments, not only the United States, but governments in other countries, he decided to essentially take to sea and sailed around the Mediterranean and other parts of the world in a small fleet crewed entirely by diehard members of Scientology known as the Sea Organization, or SeaOrg. And in one part it talks about how in Dianetics and Scientology people go through auditing in which they re-examine their life experiences, and they're supposed to essentially work their way through past experiences to detach themselves emotionally from those experiences so that those past traumatic experiences no longer affect them. And it came about that people started to claim that they remembered past lives. And at first, L. Ron Hubbard was resistant to this notion of past lives, but eventually he embraced it. And so at one point, as he's sailing around the Mediterranean with this crew of die-hard Scientologists in the SeaOrg, he convinces them all that he had lived these past lives in which he had been such and such a prince or a pirate or a so-and-so in all these past lives. So they go sailing around all these different places where he claims he remembered having caches of gold and other valuables that he buried 400 years ago and that they're going to dig up. And these die-hard members, these true believers that were in the SeaOrg, were totally convinced that they were going to go to these places that Hubbard described and dig up the treasure that he buried in his past life. And that whole incident, that it goes into more detail in the book, and that narrative I've personally found really fascinating, because it shows once you've isolated people, you have them on a boat, they're being fed entirely the doctrine of the leader. They're there with the leader, doing his every whim. They've in many ways been sort of psychologically broken down, because it describes the process in which through manual labor and punishments they were essentially under the psychological control of Hubbard. They're have reached a point where they're gonna go, yeah, this is totally plausible. We're gonna go there and we're gonna dig up the buried treasure. There was no doubt in their minds. They were convinced that it was all true and that this is what and they went to place after place and of course found nothing. Surprise! So that's just one of the more bizarre examples of L. Ron Hubbard's invention and the way in which his followers just went along with it hook, line, and sinker. And what I find interesting is that I have an interest in cults and how cults operate and different cult leaders. Another documentary that I was reminded of as I was watching this documentary and reading the book was The Source Family. You can check that out on Netflix, and maybe I'll talk about that in another video. It was somewhat around the same time period as Hubbard. Again, it's that same every other person in California was a guru in the 60s sort of thing. But even though cults operate in fairly predictable ways of breaking down the members, isolating them, feeding them doctrines, giving them this sense that they are special and they're on a mission to save the world or clear the world, as Scientologists would say, even though there are certain similarities in tactics, utilized by every cult. Every cult leader is their own idiosyncratic, individual, interesting person, and L. Ron Hubbard is no exception. He had a certain amount of personal charisma and obviously an amazing capacity for invention. He had been a professional science fiction writer. So in many ways, if you just take that capacity for imagination along with shameless ambition and being a pathological liar prone to embellishments and resume padding for personal advancement, you get the makings of a cult leader. When L. Ron Hubbard died, it was announced to the members of Scientology. The way that it was phrased and presented to the Scientologists in this auditorium was that L. Ron Hubbard didn't merely die of a stroke, which would be the boring medical fact of the matter, but rather that he was doing research into a higher OT level. OT is, OT levels, or sort of like levels of enlightenment in Scientology. He didn't merely die, but he decided to ascend to a higher level of OT consciousness by shedding the body. And I'm sorry, but once they start to talk about how the body is an impediment to higher spiritual advancement, that's usually the time that they start passing out the flavor aid. But they didn't pass out the Kool-Aid because there's way more money to be made in keeping people buying higher and higher OT levels than having them all kill themselves, right? So after the death of L. Ron Hubbard, a man named David Miscavige became the de facto leader of the church, and the way in which he's described in the book and the documentary, I'm reminded again of Stalin. I've already made that analogy several times because it's one of those situations in which money, power, and the potential of abuse, surprise, surprise, attracts a person who is rather sadistic and a control freak. It's described in the book that he has physically assaulted people on numerous occasions. The sort of person that could lose their temper and punch you in the face and then have you sent to what essentially amounts to one of their prison camps or, re-education programs in which you're forced to do manual labor or locked inside a trailer for months on end. His own wife has basically disappeared, and very few people have seen or heard from her in years. So David Miscavige is another interesting character from within the world of Scientology. For those of you familiar with cults and how they operate, much of the claims about the workings of Scientology will seem very familiar, but again, what I found interesting was the idiosyncrasies of individuals like L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige and the history of the church, because every group, every movement has its own specific history and how it came about, as well as the fact that, of course, Scientology not only has prominent spokespeople who are celebrities like Tom Cruise, but also it is an incredibly rich organization because one of its primary purposes seems to be to make as much money off as possible off of its adherents, and you basically have to buy your salvation in Scientology, as it's described by many of its members having to pay thousands upon thousands of dollars to reach higher and higher levels of training within the church. And it's fascinating. A lot of you have probably heard much of it before. The book and the documentary go into details. So again, I would recommend at the very minimum the documentary for most of you. Some of you might want to also check out the book, but I also realize that there are going to be plenty of you who are going to be like, too long, did not read. So that's it. I can't think of anything else to add for the moment. Let me know if you saw it or read the book, what you thought of it, and have a nice whatever time it is.